Well, hey, my beautiful people. How are you? I'm doing good. I'm ready to get on to the next chapter. So, the next chapter we are going to be doing is chapter 19. And we're just going to jump right on into it. Chapter 19 is the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah. This is one of the most dramatic and shocking chapters in the book of Genesis. And it's a long chapter, but we will try to go through it in a timely fashion, and it's very eye-opening, especially with what's going on in today's world. So again, for this is your first time coming on to one of my videos, I'm always looking down or looking that way. I got my Bible over here. Okay, right here. I have my notes right here, and I also have some notes on my laptop that I go through as well if I need to. So I write my notes down because if I don't, I will end up forgetting them. So I love to make notes. I love to have references and so on and so forth. Okay, so the first section of chapter 19 talks about the two angels come to Sodom. And we're going to start with verse 1 through 3. And verse 1 through 3 talks about how Lot convinces the angelic visitors to stay with him. And so 1 through 3 says, all right. And there came two angels to Sodom at even. And Lot sat in the gate of Sodom, and Lot, seeing them, rose up to meet them. And he bowed himself with his face toward the ground. And he said, Behold now, my lords, turn in, I pray you, unto your servant's house, and tarry all night, and wash your feet, and ye shall rise up early, and go on your ways. And they said, Nay, but we will abide in the street all night. And he pressed upon them greatly, and they turned in unto him, and entered into his house. And he made them a feast, and did bake unleavened bread, and they did eat. All right, so let's go ahead and break these verses down, shall we? So in verse 1, where it says two angels came to Sodom. So the two visitors that departed from Abraham in the last chapter in verse 22, they went on down to Sodom. And for the first time, they are identified as angelic beings who first accompanied the Lord as he visited Abraham at Mamre, which is back in Genesis chapter 18, verse 1 and 2. And where it says Lot was sitting at the gate of Sodom. So there was a steady progression of compromise in Lot's life. And he went from looking towards Sodom, which was back in chapter 13, verse 10, to pitching his tent toward Sodom, which was again in chapter 13, verse 12, to living in Sodom, which is chapter 14, verse 12, and losing everything when Sodom was attacked. Now, the gate area of the ancient city was sort of a town hall where the important men of the city judged disputes and conferred with one another and supervised those who entered and left the city. Lot himself was a righteous man who was grieved by the sin he saw around him, and that is referenced in 2 Peter's chapter 2, verse 7 and 8. But because of his deep compromise, few of his family and none of his friends were saved. Compromise destroyed his testimony because he was trying to compromise. All right, the next verse, is 4 and 5. And verse 4 and 5 talks about the wickedness and depravity of the men of Sodom. And 4 and 5 says, "But before they lay down, the men of the city, even the men of Sodom, compassed the house round, both old and young, all the people from every quarter. And they called unto Lot, and said unto him, Where are the men which came into thee this night? Bring them out unto us, that we may know them." So the men of the city, both young and old, surrounded the house. So right here, this shows that the entire city was given over to this violence and immorality, and that this behavior was not unusual, but accepted among the men of Sodom. A few references is in Ezekiel chapter 16, Romans chapter 1 verse 26 through 28, Leviticus chapter 18 verse 22, and chapter 20 verse 13, and Matthew chapter 5 verse 17, and chapter 19 verse 4 through 6. And those are some of the references that that kind of goes along with this. So the next couple of verses is 6 through 9. And verse 6 through 9 talks about how Lot bargains for the life and the safety of his guests. And 6 through 9 says, "And Lot went out at the door unto them, and shut the door after him, and said, I pray you, brethren, do not so wickedly. Behold, now I have 2 daughters, which I have not known man. Let me, I pray you, bring them out unto you, and do ye to them as is good in your eyes, only unto these men do nothing. For therefore came they under the shadow of my roof. And they said, Stand back. And they said, Again, this one fellow came in to sojourn, and he will needs be a judge. Now will we deal worse with thee than with them." Sorry, that was a little tongue twister there. "And they pressed sore upon the man, even Lot, and came near to break the door." Well, in verse 7, where it says, "Please do not do so wickedly," this basically means that this was a difficult argument for Lot to make. He and the men of Sodom had a completely different standard for deciding what was wicked and what was not. The men of Sodom thought they were pursuing pleasure and did not care that Lot thought that it was wicked. And all they cared about was the wickedness in their eyes. And in verse 8, where it says, "I have 2 daughters." Well, Lot offers to the mob, or Lot's offer to the mob was horrible, and cannot be justified because he was getting ready to give up his 2 daughters. The men of Sodom showed a shaking demonstration of depravity. And then you've got in verse 9 where it says, "This one keeps acting like a judge." So the men of Sodom mocked. They mocked Lot. And they rejected his efforts to provide moral and spiritual leadership. So everything that I'm reading is what's going on today. This is the modern day Sodom and Gomorrah. This world is. It's terrible. All right, then you've got verse 10 and 11. And verse 10 and 11 is the angelic protection at the door. So 10 and 11 says, "But the men put forth their hand and pulled Lot into the house to them and shut the door. And they smote the men that were at the door of the house with blindness, both small and great, so that they wearied themselves to find the door." The angelic beings, the angels, was protecting Lot and his family. from the wickedness. And so because they were mocking Lot, trying to get in, the angels blinded them because of their wickedness and what they were trying to do. So in verse 10, where it says men reached out their hands, this must have taken great supernatural strength to do what the angels did at the door. They struck all the men at the door blind. And that's what we just talked about. The angels, protected them. So the next section of the chapter is going to be about the angels' deliverance of Lot. And then we'll continue on with verse 12 through 14. Now 12 through 14 talks about how the angels warn Lot and Lot warns his family. And 12 through 14 says, And the men said unto Lot, Hast thou here any besides son-in-law, and thy sons, and thy daughters, and whatsoever thou hast in the city, bring them out of this place. So basically, he is warning Lot and his family of what's about to happen. For we will destroy this place, because the cry of them is waxen great before the face of the Lord, and the Lord hath sent us to destroy it. And Lot went out, and spoke unto his sons-in-laws, which married his daughters, and said, Up, get you out of this place, for the Lord will destroy this city. But he seemed as one that mocked unto his son-in-law. Well, in verse 12, where it says, Have you anyone else here? So the angels already knew everything. Knowing the numbers and locations of the members of Lot's family was something that was spiritually observed. Because again, in verse 12, And the men said unto Lot, Hast thou here any besides son-in-law, and thy sons, and thy daughters, and whatsoever thou hast in the city, bring them out of this place. They were trying to save Lot's family, not just Lot, but his family as well. And when it said to his son-in-law in verse 12, Lot's daughters were unmarried and had not known a man. These son-in-law men, by the ancient practice of binding, betrothal, not yet by marriage. So basically, in the ancient practice, they did what's called binding. And I think it's like a year-long, I did research on it before. I'm pretty sure it's like a year-long honeymoon, or not a honeymoon, but like a something that you go through for a year long until a binding until you are married. So that's what it means. Basically, they were unmarried and not known a man, was because they were not married yet and consecrated the marriage. So in verse 13, we will destroy this place. For the first time, Lot heard of the work of these guests to destroy, Sodom and Gomorrah. Sodom was destined for judgment, but God wanted to spare Lot and his family. And in verse 14, where it says he seemed to be joking, because at the end it says, But he seemed as one that mocked unto his sons-in-law. So when he spoke with the utmost seriousness to his son-in-laws about the judgment of God, they didn't believe him. And that's sad. Not even they would be saved from the judgment to come, because they did not believe Lot. And you can also reference that in 1 Corinthians chapter 3, verse 15. Then we've got verse 15 and 16. And 15 and 16 talks about the angels try to hurry Lot and his family. They're trying to rush them out of there, because they're getting ready to destroy it. So 15 and 16 says, And when the morning arose, then the angels hastened Lot, saying, Arise, take thy wife and thy 2 daughters, which are here, lest thou be consumed in the iniquity of the city. And while he lingered, the men laid hold upon his hand, and upon the hand of his wife, and upon the hand of his 2 daughters, the Lord being merciful unto him. And they brought him forth and set him without the city. So in 15, where it says, Arise, take your wife and your 2 daughters. So there were now no mention of the 2 son-in-laws, because they didn't believe him. They went after Lot, going to him and his house. They warned him of what was going to happen in plain words, talking about the angels. And in 16, where it says he lingered. Too much of Lot's heart was in Sodom. He knew he had to leave, but he was kind of saddened with it. The lack of urgency to obey God is a sign of compromise, and you do not want that. So you're lacking the urge to obey God. That's not good, and we all seem to do that without even realizing it. And then they brought him outside the city. So in Genesis chapter 18, this last verse that we did in the last video, Abraham asked God to spare the cities of Sodom and Gomorrah, right? And God did not spare the city, but he still answered the heart of Abraham's prayer by bringing Lot and his family out of Sodom. And then we've got verses 17 through 22. Now, 17 through 22 talks about the escape from Sodom. So it says, And it came to pass, when they had brought them forth abroad, and he said, Escape for thy life, look not behind thee. So they specifically told Lot, do not look behind you, is basically what they were saying. Neither stay thou in all the plain, escape to the mountain, lest thou be consumed. And Lot said unto them, Oh, not so, my lord. Behold, now thy servant hath found grace in thy sight, and thou hast magnified thy mercy, which thou hast shewed unto me in saving my life. And I cannot escape to the mountain, lest some evil take me, and I die. Behold, now this city is near to flee to, and it is a little one. Oh, let me escape thither, meaning it is not a little one, and my soul shall live. And he said unto him, See, I have accepted 3. I'm sorry, I read that wrong. And he said unto him, See, I have accepted thee concerning this thing also, that I will not overthrow this city for the which thou hast spoken. Haste thee, escape thither, for I cannot do anything till thou become thither, or thither. I don't know if I'm saying that right. Therefore the name of the city was called Zoar. Zoar. And that is something, a town that whenever I did my research, I didn't look up for whatever reason. I mean, I did a little bit, but not a whole heck of a lot. Alright, so in verse 17 where it says, Escape for your life, do not look back. So basically the angels were very urgent in rescuing Lot and his family. They needed to rush them out of there, get out of there as fast as possible. And in verse 22 where it says, I cannot do anything until you arrive there. Well, this answers Abraham's question, which was in verse 25 of chapter 18, which says, This be far from thee to do after this manner, to slay the righteous with the wicked, and that the righteous should be as the wicked, that be far from thee. Shall not the judge of all the earth do right? And that was his question, and he got his answer. Now, Zoar means small or insignificant. It was the little city Lot bargained with the angel about. Now, the next section of chapter 19 is God's judgment of Sodom and Gomorrah. So in verse 23 through 26, talks about how the cities were destroyed, and Lot's wife is turned to a pillar of salt. So verse 23 through 26 we will read. The sun was risen upon the earth when Lot entered unto Zoar. Then the Lord rained upon Sodom and upon Gomorrah brimstone and fire from the Lord out of heaven. And he overthrew those cities and all the plain and all the inhabitants of the cities and that which grew upon the ground. But his wife looked back from behind him, and she became a pillar of salt. Now, in verse 23, where it says Lot entered Zoar. So as the angel said in verse 22, God made a promise, and it would violate God's promise to Abraham if he didn't let Lot go to the city first. Okay? And then straight on into verse 24, where it says the Lord rained down fire and brimstone. These cities were judged completely. And if you read back in Genesis chapter 13, verse 10, Sodom was beautiful and very productive. But it didn't turn their hearts toward God. God gave them all of that and let them thrive, but their wickedness in their heart turned away from God and destroyed the city spiritually. So then in 26, where it says the wife looked back and became a pillar of salt. So the wife turned around after the angels had warned them not to, but she did anyway. All right, so in verse 27 through 29, Abraham learns about Sodom and Gomorrah's destruction. So 27 through 29 says, And Abraham gat up early in the morning to the place where he stood before the Lord. And he looked toward Sodom and Gomorrah, and toward all the land of the plain, and beheld, and lo, the smoke of the country went up as the smoke of a furnace. And it came to pass, when God destroyed the cities of the plain, that God remembered Abraham, and sent Lot out of the midst of the overthrow, when he overthrew the cities in which Lot dwelt. Now, let me look up something real quick. There's something that which was weird, that I didn't even think about. Let me look real quick. See, every time, even though I'm redoing this, even though I already went through it, I'm always thinking of something else, or I'm not remembering, or I didn't write something down. So what I'm looking up, and I probably already researched this, but I just forgot to write it down. Excuse me. Oh, excuse me. Hold on, I want to look up some real quick. So basically what I'm looking up is Lot's daughters. I can't remember if they ended up going, I can't remember, and I'm sure it's maybe in the other chapters. Okay. Okay. So yes, they did make it out. The two daughters of Lot's made it out. They did not turn around like Lot's wife did. and they fled to the nearby town of Zor, and later lived with him in a cave. Okay, let's continue on. So in verse 27, where it says, Abraham went to the place where he stood before the Lord. So Abraham was deeply moved. Abraham knew his request was answered, and that Lot and his family was safe. Now in verse 30 through 32, talks about Lot and his daughters. I should have just continued reading. It was right there. But I don't want to forget, so if I think of something, I want to look it up. And then write it down in my notes to do more in-depth research later. Just had to keep reading. Lot and his daughters live in a wilderness cave. And 30 and 32 says, Come, let us make our father drink wine, and we will lie with him. I'm sorry, let me back up. And Lot went up out of Zor, and dwelt in the mountain, and his 2 daughters with him, for he feared to dwell in Zor. And he dwelt in a cave, he and his 2 daughters. Good Lord, why didn't I just read on? Now, something else I will look up real quick is the mountain. And that's something I did not look up either. So, the Bible places Zor in the lowlands or valley near Sodom and Gomorrah. Zor was not on a mountain. It was a small city located in a valley or plain near the southern end of the Dead Sea. Okay. Sorry, guys. Sometimes I will do this. If I think of something, I'll look it up because I want you guys to know as well. And we're learning together, even though I'm doing Bible. That's what Bible study is. You're constantly thinking of new things, learning new things, even though I'm doing the Bible study and through each chapter, through each verse. And this is part of it. So, okay, so we, there is no specific mountain name. It just says, dwelt in the mountains or hill country, living in a cave, which was near Zor, but they stayed in an unnamed cave in the highlands up in the mountains, but it doesn't say exactly what. All right, so all right. In verse 31 says, all right, let me go through again. Verse 30 through 32. And Lot went up out of Zor and dwelt in the mountain, and his 2 daughters with him, for he feared to dwell in Zor. And he dwelt in a cave, he and his 2 daughters. And the firstborn said unto the younger, Our father is old, and there is not a man in the earth to come in unto us after the manner of all the earth. Come, let us make our father drink wine, and we will lie with him, that we may preserve seed of our father. And they made their father drink. Let me stop there, and let me go back to verse 30 and 32. So in verse 32, where it says, make our father drink wine. So Lot and his family lost everything in the destruction, and they quickly got a stock of wine. Either they brought it with them, or they got it in Zoar, not sure. And so let me break down verse 30 through 32 just a little bit more. So Lot's 2 grown virgin daughters had lost all that they had ever known. And this included their home, their mother, their wealth and status, and the men to whom they were engaged. The previous verse reveals their state of mind. They could not imagine that they would ever have the opportunity to be married or have children after all that they had lost. So instead of trusting the God who saved them to provide such things, they hatched a plan to provide them for themselves. This plan is horrific in both its motivation and its details. However, it's important to remember that these women were raised in a profoundly depraved culture. Their father had even arranged for their marriage of men to that city. These are 2 desperate women filled with fear and steeped in a godless environment. Their plan, as it turns out, is as simple as it is awful. It's incest. Most specifically, the women planned to get their father Lot so drunk with wine that he would not resist or even be aware of their coming to have sex with him in the night. So, now, in the very beginning, you had Adam and Eve, right? And I've already discussed this in the earliest chapters of Genesis. You have a stream, right? And this stream in the very beginning, which is Adam and Eve, and they had Cain and Abel, but they also had a lot more children, but it's not discussed in the Bible. And everything was pure and stuff, right? But Eve ate from that fruit, and that was the first sin. Give me 1 second. Okay, sorry about that. So basically, the closer to the spring, because you have a spring, then it, runs off into a stream. And in the beginning, it was not a sin in God's eyes, because how do you think they had kids? Brothers and sisters slept with each other, but it wasn't a sin back then because everything was pure. But if you go down the stream and you get further and further and way down further, after that happened with Cain and Abel, is whenever, I think it was that, I'll have to look back at my notes, but that's whenever God cut it off and said, this is getting, no, from now on, it's a sin. So, just like a stream, if it goes down way far, it starts branching off and it starts getting contaminated, right? And that's basically what was happening. And that's whenever God made a decree that it was incest. And further on down the line, the world went. So, you can look at my earlier videos, and I do talk about that in depth. And without looking at my notes, I'm sorry if I'm not explaining it exactly perfect. I do apologize with that. Okay, so let's continue on. Verse 33 through 38. And verse 33 through 38 talks about Moab and Ammon. Ammon. These two are born from this incest relationship. So 33 through 38 says, and I do believe, yep, 33 through 38 is the last verses of chapter 19. So 33 through 38 says, "And they made their father drink wine that night, and the firstborn went in and lay with her father. And, and he perceived not when she lay down, nor when she arose. And it came to pass on morrow that the firstborn said unto the younger, Behold, I lay yesternight with my father. Let us make him drink wine this night also, and go thou in and lie with him, that we may preserve seed of our father. And they made their father drink wine that night also, and the younger arose and lay with him, and he perceived not when she lay down, nor when she arose. Thus were both the daughters of Lot with child by their father. And the firstborn bare a son, and called his name Moab. The same is the father of the Moabites unto this day. And the younger, she also bore a son, and called his name Ben-Ami. The same is the father of the children of the Ammon unto this day. Ben-Ami, I'm not sure. I haven't done much research on the Ben-Ami, I don't think, yet. But anyway. In verse 33, the firstborn went in and lay with her father. So this may be uncomfortable with this being in the Bible, but it's better for children to learn about sin from the Word of God, where sin is condemned, than from dirty words from the worldly world. No one can escape knowledge of sin. No one. And in verse 37 and 38, when it talks about Moab, the father of the Moabites, and Ben-Ami, which is the father of the people of the Ammon, their descendants would become enemies and obstacles of Israel. Lot's life ends in ruin, and all because of his love for the world and the compromise that came from that love. I think there's one other, there was something up here. Okay, the son of the firstborn daughter was called Moab, and this word sounds familiar to the Hebrew term meaning from father. He became the father of the Moabite people, who would later become enemies of Israel. And likewise, the younger daughter bears a son named Ben-Ami, whose Ammonite descendants are also antagonistic towards God's people. Now, as Sodom and Gomorrah are destroyed, the two angels that rescued Lot and their grown virgin daughters after losing their mother and prospective husbands and homeland, these women sheltered in a cave with their father, reflecting a lack of spiritual guidance from their father. Lot's daughters assume that they will never be able to find husbands and have children, and echoing the heinous immorality of their home culture, the women scheme to conceive children by their own father, plying him with alcohol until he literally has no idea what is occurring or what's going on. So the son of the younger daughter that was called Ben-Ami, the name means son of my people. He eventually becomes the father of the Amorite people, and like the Moabites, both of them would later become enemies of Israel, and that's not good. And so excuse me. The Bible does not state, or if it does, I don't know, It does not record how long Lot lived or when he died. It doesn't even provide his age, but we do know that, you know, Lot's life ended in ruin, and all because of his love for the world and the compromise that came from that love. So, the biblical narrative regarding Lot's end ends completely in Genesis verse 38 at the end of chapter 19. The rest of the Bible does not mention the remainder of his life or his passing. You know, Peter describes him in the New Testament. And it's in 2 Peter's. Pretty sure. But anyway, that's it for chapter 19. I'm sorry this was a lot longer than I wanted to, but it was a lot to take in. But anyway, all right, have a good night, guys.